Reaction to the situation, and why do you call it a first step?
Anyone that looks at that video knows that this is very, very wrong. Anyone that cares about justice, about law enforcement, about our African-American community. I spent the day talking to the mayor, talking to Attorney General Keith Ellison, talking to our African-American leaders. And this is the first step because the police chief, our African-American police chief, immediately terminated the 4 officers at the scene. And that was the right thing to do. But now the offices of the county attorney in Hennepin County, as well as the FBI and outside investigations are taking place from the state. So these cases can be considered immediately, fairly, but swiftly for criminal charge, because you just can't have something like this happen. He was pleading for his life, and outsiders were telling the officer very clearly, he can't breathe, he can't breathe. This was not a sudden mistake or a procedure gone bad. This was over a period of time.
Senator, what is your perspective on why there have been as many of these types of situations in Minneapolis, let alone the state, in the last 10 years? At least 11 have died in this type of scenario. Of course, 24-year-old Jamar Clark sparked weeks of protests. That case is still somewhat in dispute, but common elements are people of color die, almost always people of color, almost never any prosecution of the cops involved, even if they are fired, and more often than not, settlements with the family. You know, to the lay people, non-lawyers, what do you got to settle with if the officers didn't need to be prosecuted? Why does it go that way as often as it has in Minnesota, in Minneapolis?
Well, I think the most famous case actually out of Minnesota was the Philando Castile case, where a young man who was loved, who worked at a school, got shot in his own car when he was pulling out his concealed carry permit. And that officer was prosecuted. That was in the neighboring county. I supported that prosecution, and the jury didn't agree with the prosecutor in that case. I think what is happening right now is that finally, people are starting to see videos of some of these cases. I think over time that changes minds, but it is not enough time to change the life for someone like George Floyd or someone like Philando Castile, or the many cases we've seen, whether they're officer involved or not, like Mr. Arbery, the innocent jogger who is running in Georgia and gets gunned down. And those people were finally prosecuted after the video emerged. So I think technology is changing things, and I think training is changing things. But there has to be so much more that happens. And mostly the public has to crowd for justice, not just the African-American community.
Right. Now, obviously, the Arbery case, which we're going to take on after this, because we'll see. One of the people who are charged there, his lawyer wants to come on. We'll see what he wants to talk about, what he doesn't. But the problem there is those aren't cops. Those were private citizens who allegedly thought they were cops in that situation.
Right. No, I said
we'll take that on separately, though, Senator. I appreciate your context call on that. Now, you know this. You were a prosecutor there. You have been criticized for not going after cops during your tenure. You would go to a grand jury if they didn't return, you know, if they didn't pass down a bill of indictment there with charges, then you didn't take it on your own to do so. Was that worthy criticism of you at the time? Do you have different perspective on it now?
Well, you look at each case, and back then, our practice was to bring these cases to a grand jury to present it for criminal charges, and this happened all over the country. I have clearly said I think it is much better now for an individual prosecutor to make a decision on the case, to take that responsibility and that accountability. I know that's what will be happening in this case. That's what happened in the Philando Castile case. And if I was the county attorney now, that's what I would be doing. And I think it just makes for much more responsibility if you basically make the decision yourself. Back then it was thought, let the community help decide how these cases should be handled. And I think that you can have much more direct justice and responsibility if the prosecutor makes those decisions.
I mean, to
as
people
well as
who
body cameras.
Well, we say they have them. We say they have them in this case, but they haven't released it. I think that's always a mistake. The reason that you have it is, of course, for accountability and to allow the police to show that they were doing their job as well. But the faster that gets to the public, the better. Here, you luckily have bystander video. But what do you say to the people in Minnesota if there are not charges brought against the officer and they just saw video of someone kneeling on the throat of somebody, begging to be let up, and bystanders seeing it as too much, when we both know nobody's taught to kneel on a throat as a suppressive move.
No.
That's that proper training. What message would that send if there are no charges?
I think that, first of all, you got to look at all the evidence. But to me, this evidence is just crying out for some kind of a charge. And that's the first thing I'd say. The second is that there are so many officers out there, as you know, in New York right now during this pandemic, doing their job every day. And I know that officers, including in my state, look at that and they think, that is wrong. That cannot happen. And that kind of message has got to be sent to the African-American community from the law enforcement community, which includes the people that will be looking at that case, that they look at it fairly, that they look at this case, and that they do what's right under the law. And I can tell you, and the police chief made this very clear. He met with the community this morning, that this is not an acceptable police technique. And